This is episode 20 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Jem Bloomfield, author of Shakespeare and the Psalms Mystery, Did Shakespeare Help Write the King James Bible? And professor at the University of Nottingham. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The substance that Shakespeare would have lived through in terms of its introduction was tobacco. Tobacco is a fascinating intoxicant. It not only is it the first of the New World intoxicants that actually becomes a popular commodity, it's an intoxicant that created an enormous amount of representational noise. It was all over the stage, it was all over the popular print, elite print, and so on. Everybody was talking about tobacco.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Whether it was beer, ale, tobacco, or other plant-based stimulants, almost every man and woman in 16th century London, from the brothel to the royal court, had an opinion on and often tried intoxicants. Substances like tobacco, ale, beer, and even chocolate were being brought to England for the very first time by explorers who were traveling to new worlds and returning with samples of exciting crops that grabbed hold of England's collective attention and impacted both the economy and business innovation of a vibrant trade industry in London. In today's episode, Phil Withington is here to talk about intoxicants of early modern England, the title subject of an article he wrote in 2011 and published in the Historical Journal. Phil Withington is an author, professor, and head of history at the University of Sheffield. He trained as a historian in Cambridge and is the former editor of the Historical Journal and principal investigator of the joint professional project Intoxicants and Early Modernity. Phil joins us today to explain the everyday role of intoxicants in Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as what we can tell about the use of alcohol and tobacco in Shakespeare's plays when we understand the kind of reputation these new intoxicants held for people in the 16th century. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
When looking back at the events of the past, it's quite easy to apply a modern worldview to elements like alcohol, tobacco, and intoxicants, even though for people in the 16th century England, these elements were new to their society and held an entirely different purpose and reputation than we give them today. Phil writes in his article, Intoxicants and Society in Early Modern England, that for people like Shakespeare, the boom in global trade economy made alcohol, tobacco, and about a century later, coffee, part of, quote, culture of respectability. Phil, I wonder if you can help us unpack this concept just a bit of how intoxicating substances have changed in their cultural reputation since Shakespeare's time.
I think, first of all, the point of stress is the 17th century is a really important period of time for intoxicants in terms of the European diet and consumption. What you have on the one hand, as you just alluded to, is this kind of commercialization of old world intoxicants, in particular alcohols. The wine trade flourished, beer consumption was commercialized, replacing ale, and so on. And there was big money to be made from these commodities. They'd always been there, but there was this commercial element to it. But at the same time, as you also allude to, there's this kind of introduction of new substances, mainly from the Atlantic world, also from Asia as well to some extent later. And these kind of were in tension and challenged each other, and also provided new ways for people to socialize and to consume. Previous to the 17th century, alcohols were the primary form of intoxicants, and they were used not simply as we might use them to relax and to get out of our heads, achieve other states of sensation and so on. They were also used for nutritional purposes. They were the equivalent of water or tea later on in England, or coffee perhaps in the States, this kind of like staple feature of the diet. And they were also used for medicine. There's this kind of ubiquity to alcohol. And what's interesting in relation to that is because obviously they have an intoxicating quality, there is always this possibility of actually taking it for one purpose, nutrition, and then becoming drunk in the process. So there's that underlying tension. What you have with these milder intoxicants coming in from the New World is the possibility of kind of regular diet without alcohol. In the process of these becoming established much later than Shakespeare's time, it should be stressed, this is kind of the 18th century, they become associated with new kinds of respectability and civility. So coffee and tea are kind of not necessarily class related, but certainly in much more associated with a kind of anti-alcohol sort of perspective.
I think the reputation I'm driving at is things like in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the nurse cries for Peter to bring her aqua vitae when she is stressed out and sad over Romeo killing Tybalt. In fact, she calls for aqua vitae several times in this play, and it plays this role of comforting the emotionally upset in several scenes of that play. But for a lot of actors who say this line, there's a little bit of confusion because they don't have the aqua vitae reference and they don't quite know what it means. In his article, Phil quotes Paul Rycott from 1668, citing aqua vitae specifically as a substance the Ottomans would use to get drunk. Phil, for William Shakespeare, was aqua vitae a substance to get drunk, or was it more medicinal? How was it used by the average man or woman in the 16th century?
Well, that's a really good example of that tension that we were talking about. Aqua vitae is used, it's associated, it's the water of life, it's a distilled liquor. And it's kind of, so distilled wine would be brandy, you have the potatoes of vodka, whiskey, and so on. And all of these have been made in different places around Europe. In the Romeo and Juliet scene, it's kind of medicinal qualities are being emphasized. It's medicine of the mind as well as the body, of course, and they are very closely intertwined in Shakespeare's period. But at the same time, aqua vitae is incredibly strong. It's a distilled liquor and it has massive impacts on the body and the mind as well, which you don't necessarily want. So there's that always that danger in taking it. But it's a really good example of that tension between medicine and recreational drinking. I think probably what's interesting and possibly surprising for some audiences and actors is distilled liquors tends to be associated with the 18th century and gin, the gin craze, and so on. But in fact, it's been made and consumed a lot in the 16th and 17th centuries. In fact, it goes back to the medieval period. And there's every sign that you have the worshipful company of distillers is actually formed in 1638 to get a monopoly of distilling, which kind of suggests that this kind of the profits that are available and the popularity that aqua vitae has amongst the populace because of its medicinal, but also because of its recreational possibilities.
Well, in Phil's article, he also addresses other substances beyond aqua vitae, like chocolate and tea. But Phil, were these substances part of Shakespeare's everyday life? Would he have consumed chocolate and tea?
No. Tea is very much an 18th century commodity. Chocolate also, there is a sort of, with coffee and chocolate, they start to become, they're kind of rare and exotic luxuries from the middle of the 17th century, from the 1650s. But there's every indication that even though you have the development of the coffee house from the 1660s onwards, in fact, there's not actually very much coffee being consumed in them. That takes place in the 18th century, and tea is definitely something that became popular only in the 18th century, and its popularity was related to greater accessibility and availability, and also reduction in price. So the substance that Shakespeare would have lived through in terms of its introduction was tobacco. That's the first one, and that had a fairly significant impact on his society and culture.
Well, for 16th century society, alcohol and tobacco had kind of a range of supporters. Phil's article outlines how the humanist movement created something of a contradiction for the substances, with part of society lauding their medicinal benefits and still others seeking to confine alcohol in particular to moderation, as excess would cause, quote, the passions and humors to be allowed free rein, which was horrible to 16th century society. And Phil, please explain the distinction for people like Shakespeare when it comes to alcohol. Was there a societal thought process or mindset let's say, that a drunk person would not have been considered responsible for their behavior, that it would be the alcohol to blame?
That's a good question. I think the fundamental conception is that drunkenness, through imbibing different kinds of alcohol and so on, led to a loss of reason, which equated with a loss of humanity, essentially. And I think this is most vividly illustrated by a fantastic little satire by a guy called Thomas Heywood in 1635, obviously after Shakespeare's dead, but very much dealing with kinds of ideas that Shakespeare would have known about. This satire called The Drunkard, in which Heywood shows how different character types become different kinds of animal when drunk. So you have the crafty man becoming the crafty drunk, the fox. In fact, he actually isn't really drunk, he's pretending to be drunk and then taking advantage of everybody who is drunk. You have the goat becoming a goat who's lecherous and dodgy with the other opposite sex and so on. You have pigs become dirty and things like that. And that really kind of gets to this idea of the loss of reason. You are handing yourself over to beastliness. And at the same time, related to that, it could have a massive impact on your internal humoral equilibrium. Shakespeare and his contemporaries understood the body as being constituted by this balance of humours, which links to temperaments, and destabilizing those with excessive amounts of alcohol could have a sort of someone who tends to the melancholy will become excessively melancholy and violent, excessively violent, and so on. So it was a really hazardous thing, this whole drinking thing. On the one hand, you do have this kind of reliance on it. You have a reliance on wine or beer, ale, aquavita for medicinal and nutritional purposes. I think it's been calculated that a massive amount of ordinary person's calorific requirements were actually taken from alcohol in this period, rather than simply food, as we might assume today.
In his article, Phil mentions Shakespeare's Henry V specifically as one of the places in Shakespeare's works where alcohol, and in Henry V it's ale, is mentioned in relation to someone's actions. The character of Llewellyn gets intoxicated and kills his best friend, with Shakespeare housing that occurrence in the phrase, "In his ales and his anger, look you did kill his best friend Clitus." Based on what you know about the relationship between alcohol and behavior for the 16th century mindset, Phil, help us understand what was going on in Shakespeare's mind when he wrote this scene. Is he giving Alexander an out in that scene and saying that he's not fully responsible for Clitus's death?
I think in that scene, Llewellyn is talking to Gower, I think, and describing Henry, or comparing Henry to Alexander the Great. I think it's Alexander who Llewellyn describes as killing his friend Clitus, rather than Llewellyn actually doing it himself. My understanding of the scene is that Shakespeare is having Llewellyn compare, in quite a kind of funny way, I suppose, a wry way. He's comparing the British scene, contemporary Britain, in terms of, and Henry being born at Monmouth in Wales, with Alexander being born in Macedonia, obviously on the in the Greek lands, and then comparing Henry and Alexander on that basis. And I think they both have similarly kind of volcanic tempers and are given to kind of rages and so on, which the alcohol in this instance exacerbates in terms of Alexander's behaviour, killing his friend with a javelin. And I think Llewellyn is kind of riskily saying that Henry could do the same, even though he hasn't actually killed a man yet. So it's quite a good example of this idea that we were just talking about, of intoxicants diminishing reason and kind of accentuating potentially dangerous humoral aspects of the personality.
If you are that Shakespeare Life patron, you can download the illustrated life map called Shakespeare's Place in History that includes the event in 1586 when Sir Walter Raleigh first brought tobacco over to England. Famously, it's been said that he tried to get Queen Elizabeth to smoke tobacco. In his article, Phil talks about the advent of tobacco into English society and mentions that not everyone was able to afford it. Now, you alluded to this earlier, Phil, but please explain for us the reality of a society where everyone was talking about tobacco, everyone knew about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was widely used.
Yeah, I mean, tobacco is a fascinating intoxicant. It not only is the first of the kind of the New World intoxicants that actually takes becomes a popular commodity, which makes it important in that respect. But it's also, it's an intoxicant that created an enormous amount of representational noise after from its introduction in the 1580s. And that noise became a kind of crescendo in the late 1590s, 1610s, 1600s. It was all over the stage. It was all over the popular print, elite print, and so on. Everybody was talking about tobacco. Tobacco was claimed by all sorts of discourses and characterized in all sorts of ways. It was the kind of the universal panacea which would cure every kind of disease that man could get. It was this a fantastic social lubricant. It was this emblem of social class and kind of coolness, if you like. I suppose the equivalent of the kind of the cool commodities or substances that get taken today. But there's this great weird irony is that until the 1620s, when the Chesapeake plantations get going and the Atlantic tobacco trade becomes established, it's very expensive and it's a very relatively rare commodity. It comes mainly through Spanish trade routes, which are very problematic because of the political tensions between England and Spain. There simply isn't much tobacco in circulation for people to actually smoke or to chew for their toothache and so on. So on the one hand, you do have this kind of enormous publicity for the herb, but on the other hand, it would have only been fairly kind of wealthy and elite people who could have got it until the late 1620s.
Well, I mean, it was a cool substance, but not everyone exactly held that opinion, because I think there's evidence that Queen Elizabeth got a taste for it. But what was James I's opinion on tobacco once we moved into Jacobean England?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely didn't regard it as cool. He has a very famous tract against tobacco, I think published in 1604. So it's interesting because it's one of his first public acts as king, certainly in terms of the public sphere, is to publish a diatribe against the herb, which is a big thing for a king to do. And it's obviously his subjects do have to take their king's views seriously. And what he does, he associates it with savagery, with barbarity. He says the medicinal claims made for tobacco are ridiculous, self-evidently wrong. He tries to tax it out of existence. He's completely opposed to it, which makes the kind of the counter culture around it and the kind of the way it's been valorized by so many other different writers and playwrights and so on extremely interesting, because he's giving them something to disagree with him about in a way that isn't possibly a monarchical thing to do.
Another intoxicant that changed the economic landscape of England and made a splash in this way was the innovations around beer production. I think your article mentions women held a key role in creating a distinction between ale and beer when Brewsters, as they were called, dominated the beer production industry before beer was widely commercialized. Phil, can you tell us about women in this role? I don't think women were allowed to hold or operate businesses and commercial ventures. So why was it acceptable and even profitable for women to work as Brewsters?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a slight misconception that women aren't involved in economic activity or even commercial economic activity, in that most economic activity is based in the household. And although women might not be named as the owner or proprietor or so on, we know that they were often deeply involved in how that kind of household functioned economically and what it produced. So and interestingly, this podcast's kind of perspective, printers in particular, the printing trade had a lot of women working with their husbands and then carrying on the business as widows thereafter. With Brewsters, this refers to the fact that a lot of production and consumption of ale in particular, which was by far the most popular and mass consumed intoxicant before the 17th century, a lot of it was produced very locally and almost kind of as a secondary occupation, drunk very locally. Often ale houses were actually the front rooms of someone's house, their parlour or whatever, their kitchen. The fact that women were so involved in that kind of process, isn't surprising, because they would be obviously making stuff aside from any other kind of economic activity. They would be making food and drink within the house anyway. But also because alehouses were a kind of, not always, but often a form of poor relief as well. If a household was struggling within a village or a town, they would be granted the license to produce ale as a kind of way of supplementing household income. So it's kind of not surprising at all for both of those reasons, the fact that women did have an economic profile within the household and the fact that ale in particular was associated with this kind of sort of subsistence kind of economy, that women are involved in it. What's interesting is that when beer's introduced from the Low Countries into England in the later 16th century, it kind of takes hold. And the thing about beer is that it has hops, and hops means that beer, as opposed to ale, can be moved distances, and it also keeps for quite a long period of time. And this means that one of the reasons that beer becomes actually a much more commercially viable product, which can be, shipped out of London into different places and so on, in a way that ale simply can't and isn't. And what's interesting is that women are completely excluded from the civic and guild offices through which the beer economy would have been regulated. And it's kind of been observed by historians that whenever women get pushed out of a kind of industry or a trade and have this kind of, no longer have a kind of profile within it, that shows that the industry and trade has become especially viable and profitable. It doesn't mean they're not necessarily participating in the brewing within the household economy, but what they're not doing is they're not being members of the guilds regulating beer brewing and so on.
Well, it should be stated, as I ask this next question, that we don't know for sure or precisely what led to the death of William Shakespeare, but some historians have suggested that his death was related to the consumption of alcohol, arguing that he was out drinking with Ben Jonson the night before he died and contracted pneumonia in part because he was unable to properly protect himself from the elements. Now, all of that is conjecture, but the question that's buried in that idea is the idea of 16th century, early 17th century men going out and drinking heavily together. In terms of what we know about early modern behavior and habits concerning alcohol, does that theory about Shakespeare's death make sense, or is it totally off base?
I think it makes total sense in that amongst certain, in particular, masculine groups and in Elizabethan and Jacobean society, ritualized heavy drinking became a really important form of male company. And I think actors, playwrights, and so on were especially kind of connected or linked to this kind of behavior. My understanding of Shakespeare, I'm not a Shakespeare expert, my understanding of Shakespeare is that his milieu was slightly different to that of Ben Jonson, who was a massive boozer and a real man of company. But I think they did become closer towards the end of Shakespeare's career and so on. Of course, and Jonson is definitely involved in this kind of behavior. So it was an urban myth in the late 17th century, wasn't it? I think that there were stories that this is how Shakespeare had met his end. Whether they're true or not, I think your point is absolutely right, that they're completely plausible in terms of what men of his interests and class might have been doing.
Well, this entire topic of intoxicants in early modern England is wide and vast, and certainly as it relates to Shakespeare, there is a lot more that we could cover. And this one conversation, we've only taken a small bite out of Phil's article. So we know there's more to discover. And in addition to reading Phil's full article, which I will link to in the show notes for today's episode, what other sources were helpful to you, Phil, in writing your article that you might recommend for those of us that are excited to explore further?
If I may, I'll plug the Intoxicants and Early Modernity website and database. This is the result of 3.5 years of research on a whole massive range of sources, from kind of economic records through to court depositions and court cases, through to material culture, objects of intoxication, through to legislation and popular print and so on. And that's all been put together for people to peruse and to use for their own interest or for their own research. and should be going live later this month or next month, I think. That's Intoxicants and Early Modernity. The sources that we've used pulled together for that database, they're really good sources for getting kind of into the real culture of the period. So if you can get to the church court records are particularly good. Sometimes inadvertently they have amazing stories about people and their drinking and eating habits and so on, and what happens to them in the course of those kinds of events. There's an enormous range of popular literature, from ballads through theatre. I mean, plays are fantastic as evidence, as well as obviously dramatic accounts of drinking and intoxication. Yeah, so is that enough?
Yeah, yes. Yes. That's exactly the kind of stuff I was talking about. And actually the church records are available, at least some of them are available as part of the Folger Shakespeare Library's digital archives that have just been launched. So you can actually peruse those without having to fly to London, which is convenient. But I believe that reading is an essential part of exploring Shakespeare, and indeed part of learning at all. And so we ask each guest who visits with us here at That Shakespeare Life to give their favorite book recommendations. As one guest put it, this would be the title you would take with you if you were stranded on a deserted island. What are your favorite books, or this could be one or two, that have made the biggest impact on you?
Oh, biggest impact. I don't know about long-term impact. I'm going to go for ones that I've read relatively recently. There's a fantastic new edition of the Sonnets by Ralph Lyne and Cathy Schrank, which utilizes sort of digitized records and early English books online and so on to give this incredible scholarly apparatus around the sonnets. But I imagine people are aware of that, so that wouldn't be one I'll take. Okay. What I would take, I think recently, is I would take Ralph Taylor's Summer, by Keith Wrightson, who's a social historian at Yale University. That came out a few years ago. It's a fantastic micro-study of a scrivener in Newcastle in the northeast of England during the plague years of the 1630s, and as well as reconstructing Ralph Taylor's life and what he's doing and how people are suffering and so on and coping with the plague in Newcastle at the time. It's also a fantastic introduction to the range of different sources that a social historian of the early modern period can use. So that's a really good book in lots of ways, and beautifully written as well. And then slightly differently, I would go for Chris Marsh's blockbuster on music and society in early modern England, which is a massive book, which is just got reams and reams of stuff about how music is completely embedded in 16th and 17th century English life in various ways. And again, uses a vast array of sources to kind of recreate the noisescapes and soundscapes of towns and countries and villages.
Those sound fascinating. We will link to those and definitely be checking those out. Thank you so much for those recommendations. But what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I've got a few things on the go. I'm writing a new social history of the English Renaissance for Princeton University Press. So that's a kind of a bit of a priority at the moment. I'm getting very excited about that. I'm doing some articles and outputs from the Intoxicants and Early Modernity research project, which I just mentioned, the database. And so hopefully stuff will be coming out from that over the next few years. I'm co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Thomas More's Utopia with Cathy Schrank. And it's a really, really interesting project. It's basically looking at the text of Thomas More's Utopia from 1516 and getting essays on all the different moments and different languages, different contexts in which the text is translated from the 16th century through to the 20th century. So we have contributions of Thomas More's Utopia in China, in Japan, in the Middle East, as well as in European countries and in Eastern European countries and so on. And what's interesting with that is that it tends to be translated just before a revolution, which is great.
Fascinating stuff. Well, thank you so much, Phil Withington, for being here and being our guide back into 16th century England as we explore intoxicants of Shakespeare's life. I have learned a lot from you today, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit cassidycash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.